17 days after the funeral, my daughter called it practical. I called it my life. The porch light clicked on at dusk the way it always had, steady and polite. I stood under it with my coat still on and my keys in my hand, feeling the house breathe in a way only quiet houses do. Practical, she said. My name on the title answered without raising its voice. We had gathered at the family restaurant on Maple Street, where the waitress knew our order and the iced tea tasted like July even in October. Lily arrived with her fiancé, Blake, and a tote bag that looked heavier than her smile. She hugged me, squeezed a little too hard, and started laying papers on the table like a person setting tiles in a pattern only they can see. He said hello and sat with his shoulders square, as if he had practiced being reasonable in a mirror. "Mom," she began, "we want to help you be practical." She landed on the word again as though it were a safe place to stand. I nodded because nodding has prevented more arguments than eloquence ever has. She slid a checklist toward me, printed in neat columns with boxes waiting for my pen. "Downsize the garage," it said. "Sell the second car," it said. "Consider a realtor," it said. I sipped my tea and let the ice ring the glass like a small bell. I do not mind lists. I raised a child using lists and the kind of refrigerator magnets that hold permission slips without complaint. What I minded was the tone that arrived with the paper. It sounded like a manager narrating a meeting I had not agreed to attend. Blake spoke about timelines and safety. He spoke about freed equity and lower maintenance, as if the house were a stubborn employee who needed corrective coaching. The steak cooled. The waitress refilled our water. I folded my napkin with slow hands and placed it on my plate. "Thank you for caring," I said, and I meant it. "Tonight I need to go home. Tomorrow I will look through my papers." Lily wanted to keep talking, but I smiled the way you do when you guide a shopping cart gently away from a display you cannot fix. We paid, hugged in the parking lot, and stood in the glow of a neon sign that promised homemade pie. She said, "We love you," and I answered, "I know. Love is not the question. Boundaries are." The house met me with lemon oil and dust in the hall light. I placed my purse on the entry table where a blue tin box has lived for 20 years. Mary chose that box for our marriage papers. I kept it for everything else after she died because objects do not panic. I clicked off the porch light, set the kettle, and carried the tin to the kitchen like it was bread from a neighbor. The lid made a small, respectful sound as it opened. Inside were titles, registrations, HOA notices, and the quiet envelope I keep in the glove box for days when paper needs to do the talking. Grief rearranges a house. You learn where your hands naturally go when you think you are alone. Mine went to the drawer with pens that all write blue. I dated a page in a legal pad and wrote a single sentence the way carpenters snap a chalk line. I will choose steady over noise. Then I made tea, leaned against the counter, and let the warm cup say what there were no good words for. The last 17 days had taught me that silence can be strong without being cold. The kettle clicked as it cooled. The refrigerator hummed as if it were breathing. In the morning, I called the church office and left a message for Pastor Harris. I did not ask for counsel about law. I asked for a prayer for clarity and kindness, which is different. He called back before lunch and said he had already prayed. I thanked him and turned to the stack on the kitchen table, which had become a small landscape of envelopes and clips. The sunlight caught the edges like frost on a fence. I placed 3 folders side by side: house, vehicle, and notes. It sounds simple because it is. I have found that when a family is leaning, simple is a handrail. The deed sat in the house folder like a good anchor. My name was on it, and the date felt both recent and a lifetime ago. The car title waited where I left it, which is to say it did not sell itself overnight. I smiled at the thought and wrote, "No sales today. on my notes page. Then I reached for the glove box envelope I keep in the hall, tucked behind Mary's scarf. It holds copies of the things people argue about when they do not need to. I set those copies next to the originals and exhaled. By mid-morning, Lily texted that she and Blake would stop by to get the ball rolling. I read the message twice and heard the ball in my head, rubber on a gym floor that echoes. I replied with a time that worked for me and added, "Let's talk at the kitchen table." The table holds better than the couch when conversations try to spill. Before they arrived, I visited the HOA office on Cedar Avenue. It is a small building with a clean window and a bulletin board that changes with the seasons. Mrs. Ruiz manages our community with firm kindness and a binder that could settle arguments without raising her voice. I asked her to confirm the process for notices regarding property decisions. She answered the way she always does, plainly and within her lane. "Ownership governs decisions," she said. "If you need to document a boundary, do it in writing. Keep it courteous. We keep copies if necessary." I thanked her and walked home past lawns that were learning fall. At 2:00, Lily and Blake came through the side door because they still have a copy of the key from last winter. I will change that soon, I thought, and added it to my notes. Lily looked around with a face that tried to be gentle and landed on brisk. Blake carried a clipboard as if houses listen more closely to those. I poured coffee. We sat. "I made some folders," I said. "They help me think." Lily smiled the way you smile at a child who has lined up toys by color. "Great, Mom," she said. "We can go through ours, too." Blake opened his binder and started with the garage. He talked about the drill press I have not used in 3 years. He mentioned the old lathe and the boxes marked Christmas that have not seen December since Mary got sick. I nodded and wrote, "Sort garage next month," because nothing in the garage is on fire. We can respect objects and time at the same pace. Then they suggested selling the sedan. "You don't drive 2 cars," Lily said, circling the word sell like it would grow if you fed it ink. "It just sits there and loses value." I slid the vehicle folder so they could see the title and the insurance. "It sits there," I said, "because it is mine and because I like to have it." Her eyes softened, then sharpened again. I took a breath and added, "If I decide to sell, I will do it. Not today." Blake cleared his throat and raised the question of a realtor. He had a card ready, printed in a shade of blue that thinks it is trustworthy. "Inventory is tight," he said. "This is the perfect time to unlock equity. We can get you somewhere smaller and safer." He said "we" as if the house had already agreed. I turned the house folder toward me and rested my hands on either side, palms flat like a person steadying a map. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "I am not listing the house." Lily blinked as if someone had dimmed the room. "Mom, we're just trying to help," she said. "We want to make sure you're safe and not overwhelmed." I nodded again because both are fine desires. "I hear that," I answered. "I will set the pace." We sat with that sentence between us. I have learned that sentences need room to settle. The clock in the hall measured the moment with its light, regular heart. Outside, a dog barked twice in the kind of voice that says, "Mailman," and then lost interest. Blake glanced at Lily. She glanced back. I kept my hands still. "Here is what I can do," I said, and I spoke slowly because slow keeps a conversation useful. "I will sort the garage next month, and you can help if you like. I will keep both cars for now. We are not using the word sell today. We are not calling a realtor. If either of you need to come by, you will text first and wait for a yes. The spare key comes back to me tonight. No decisions are made about my house without my written consent. That includes emails to vendors, neighbors, or the HOA. Lily's face went through 3 expressions I recognized from her childhood: surprise, stubbornness, and the sudden understanding that the rule is not an insult. She set her pen down. "Okay," she said, though the word held more weather than the calendar promised. "We can do that." Blake adjusted his chair. He looked at the house folder as if it might argue on his behalf. When it did not, he settled too. I opened the blue tin and removed the envelope from the glove box. Paper has a way of calming a room. I laid out copies of the deed, the insurance, the utility accounts, and the HOA's general notice template Mrs. Ruiz had printed for me years ago when Mary was still here and we were planning for repairs. I did not recite policies. I did not lecture. I let the pages be the steady voice I wanted to keep. "I am not angry," I said. "I am hurt by the way this felt decided in a parking lot. The way to respect me now is to respect the pace and the boundaries I'm setting. I will write down what we agreed and email it, so no one has to remember it poorly." Lily nodded. Her eyes wet the way mine had 12 hours earlier when I stood in the porch light and let the night fold around my shoulders. She reached for my hand and squeezed once, old code between new expectations. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the word did more work than any checklist. "I know you miss Mom." I squeezed back and said the only true reply. "I do." We stood there in the kitchen with the smell of coffee and paper and the sense that a line had been drawn without anyone bleeding. Blake cleared his throat again, but this time it sounded like a person adjusting to weather, not trying to command it. "We'll return the key," he said. "We'll text before we drop by, and we'll hold the realtor conversation until you bring it up." It was not surrender. It was respect wearing new shoes. I thanked them. Before they left, I walked them to the door and stood on the small rug Mary loved because it caught mud without looking like it tried too hard. The afternoon had become the kind of gold October offers when it wants to apologize for August. I reminded them of Sunday dinner. I reminded them we are a family who sits at tables and tells the truth with gentle voices. They drove away slow, careful like people learning a new street. After they left, I wrote an email to both of them. It was brief and clear. I thanked them for their help and restated the agreements in 3 lines. I copied myself and printed a copy for the folder because future minds are not always kind to memory. Then I washed the coffee cups, dried them, and set them in their places because order is a prayer your hands can say when your throat refuses. I took a short walk around the block. The maples had begun their slow rehearsal for winter. Neighbors waved the way neighbors do when they have kind eyes and busy afternoons. I stopped by the community board and read the postings. Lost cat, church luncheon, flu shots at the library next Thursday. Ordinary life continued at its unbothered pace. I let my steps match it. Back home, I called Mrs. Ruiz and thanked her for her time. I told her I might file a courtesy notice later in the week, confirming that all communications regarding my property would come from me. She said, "That's fine," in a tone that has seen more storms than our street signs admit. We wished each other a good evening, and I felt the house lightened by 1/2 ounce. There is a particular relief that arrives when a boundary holds. It does not dance or sing. It sits in a chair and takes off its boots. I cooked a simple dinner and ate with the radio on low, the announcer's voice turning the day's news into manageable sentences. After the dishes, I pulled a small box from the pantry shelf. Inside was a letter Mary wrote to our daughter on Lily's 21st birthday. It was sealed then and opened that same day, but I had kept a copy because we kept copies of the good things, too. I read it again at the table. Mary wrote about kindness that does not perform. She wrote about leaving rooms better than you found them. She wrote about grown children and the soft courage it takes to see your parents as people with their own afternoons. I traced her signature with a fingertip and felt the familiar ache of presence wrapped as absence. Then I placed the copy back in the box and returned it to the shelf. Before bed, I stood at the window and watched the porch light warm the steps. The yard looked like a small promise. I locked the door, checked the stove, and folded the dish towel the way Mary liked. I slept with the steadiness that arrives when you decide not to argue with a storm. Morning would bring other tasks: a courtesy email to confirm our agreements, a visit to the library, a call to the mechanic about the car that is staying because I like it. For now the house held. When I woke, the sun had the early brightness that forgives late starts. I made oatmeal and wrote the email to Lily and Blake, cleaner than the handwritten notes. The subject line was simple: house and schedule. I affirmed the boundaries in plain words. I added that Sunday supper stood, and that my front door is a door, not a revolving one. Then I sent it and watched the tiny whoosh as if it were the sound of a line drawing itself on a map. At 9, I heard the familiar footsteps of Mr. Bennett next door. He taps his cane twice on my porch rail when he wants to talk without a phone. I opened the door and he lifted the grocery bag in his hand like a medal. "Apples," he said, "from the farmer's market. Too many for me." We sat on the steps and spoke in sentences that do not hurry. He asked how I was managing. I said, "With paper, coffee, and kindness." He nodded as if I had described a well-built chair. "That will hold," he said. I told him about the conversation with Lily and Blake, careful to speak with respect. He nodded again and said something I wrote down later because it belongs in a folder of its own. "Helping is a good word," he said, "but it does not mean pushing, and it never means deciding." We finished our apples, and he patted the rail the way you pat a faithful dog. Then he went home, and I went inside to meet the day. By noon, Lily replied to my email. "Thank you, Mom," she wrote. "We'll follow your plan. I'm sorry for last night. See you Sunday." I read it twice and felt my shoulders came down from my ears. The house breathed with me. I printed her note, not because I needed proof, but because some words deserve paper. That afternoon, I cleaned the kitchen and set out 3 plates for supper because muscle memory is a tender thing. I tucked the spare key in a small envelope for when they brought it back. I wrote "boundaries" on the flap and smiled at the small ceremony of it. The doorbell rang at 5. They stood together, hands linked, key ready. I received it the way you receive a token at the end of a pilgrimage. We hugged. We did not discuss sales or equity. We ate stew and spoke of work, laundry, and the new bakery on Oak Lane. When they left, the house felt like itself again. Not younger, not louder, just itself. I washed the bowls, dried them, and set them in their places. I placed the envelope with the key in the blue tin and closed the lid with that same respectful sound. Then I sat at the table with a pen and wrote a few lines for my future self. "You kept your voice low," I wrote. "You kept your pace. You set kind rules and let them hold." The next morning brought a different kind of work, not hard, just precise. I opened a new document and titled it "Courtesy Notices." The words looked official without making noise. I wrote a short note to the HOA confirming that all property communications should be addressed to me. I did not mention anyone else. I did not describe last night. I thanked Mrs. Ruiz for her time and attached the general forms she had once shared. I printed a copy and slipped it into the house folder like a steady plank in a well-built floor. Then I drafted a second message, addressed to Lily and Blake together. It restated our agreements plainly and added small logistics so no one would have to guess. "Sunday dinners continue," I wrote. "Text before visiting. I will decide on the garage in November." I ended with a sentence that felt like a hand on a shoulder. "Thank you for respecting the pace." I sent both messages and watched the small whoosh again. A quiet sound, a clean line drawn. After lunch, I stopped by the library for the flu clinic and a book on winter shrubs. The librarian stamped the due date with a soft thump that sounded like affirmation. Ordinary tasks, completed without debate, are a kind of medicine. On my way out, I saw a flyer for a town yard sale in 2 weeks. I noted the date and thought of Mary's scarf drawer and the box of teacups that deserved fresh hands. Downsizing does not need a spotlight. It needs a table and a morning. Back at home, I set my phone on the counter and listened to the house. The refrigerator breathed. The heater kicked on and settled like a cat finding its spot. Peace is not loud, but you know when it is present. I gathered a stack of papers that needed shredding and a few that needed filing. I can live with piles for a day. I cannot live with confusion after a conversation that asks for clarity. In the afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found an envelope from the insurance company. Routine paperwork, nothing sharp. I opened it with the letter opener Mary liked because it felt like a tiny sword. I smiled at the thought, then carried the mail inside and stacked it where the sun could sit on it. A text arrived from Lily asking if I needed anything from the store. I told her I was fine and asked about her shift at the clinic. She replied with a photo of the new lab coats. The conversation returned to its proper size. Helpful, respectful, no managing verbs. That evening, I wrote a simple courtesy notice to a few vendors who had fielded calls from someone other than me last week. I thanked them for their patience and asked that future quotes be emailed to my address only. I did not need anyone in town to take sides. I only needed them to follow a small rule that keeps a family from turning every choice into a referendum. Most people prefer a clear address anyway. It lets them close the tab and move on with their day. On Thursday, I set a box by the front door for the yard sale. A few sweaters, a cake stand we used twice, and the string lights from the back porch that burned out one at a time like a long goodbye. I do not throw away what can be used again. The box looked modest. Modest is enough. Friday afternoon, Blake knocked and waited on the porch as agreed. He held the spare key in a small envelope, like a person delivering a fragile medal. I invited him in, and we shared coffee that did not require any new vocabulary. He spoke about work. I told him the HOA appreciated the courtesy notice. He nodded in a way that said he understood why a short email can hold a larger piece. Before he left, he paused and met my eyes without a clipboard between us. "Thank you for spelling things out," he said. "It helps." I said it helps me too. On Saturday morning, I took Mr. Bennett to the hardware store for furnace filters and the kind of screws that behave themselves. We walked the aisles slowly and let the young clerk explain options as if we were deciding national policy. Back home, we changed the filter and marked the date on the calendar. Small tasks done on time can keep grief from reinventing itself as chaos. I have learned that. Sunday came with stew in the pot and the good plates on the table. Lily and Blake arrived with a bakery pie and the key already returned, which felt like a paragraph ending with a period, not a question mark. We ate with the easy talk that families use when they are not performing. After dinner, I brought out a copy of Mary's letter from years ago and asked if Lily would like to read it again. She held the pages and breathed the way you do when memory walks into the room carrying something heavy and beautiful. We read silently, side by side. Then she touched the signature and placed the letter back on the table with care. "I'm sorry for trying to steer," she said. "I thought I was helping. I didn't see the cost." I nodded and offered the sentence that keeps saving us. "Helping is not deciding," I said, "but helping can be beautiful when it listens." She wiped her eyes and the moment closed without drama. Natural consequences had done their quiet work. No scenes, no spectacle, just two adults adjusting to a new slope in the family road. The week after, I filed the HOA confirmation and a polite acknowledgement from our realtor friend who would wait until I called him first. I thanked him, and he sent a thumbs up, the universal sign for a conversation finding its right size. I scheduled the garage sort for the first Saturday of November and placed a small snack basket by the workbench so the day would feel like a plan, not a punishment. Lily asked if she could still help. I said yes, with labels and patience. She laughed and said she had both. On Wednesday, I met Mrs. Ruiz to review the community board updates. She asked lightly how things were at home. I said they were steady. She patted the binder that rules our small collection of streets and said, "Paper is not everything, but it is often enough." We both smiled at the wisdom tucked inside that ordinary sentence. She handed me the winter newsletter, and we talked about the potluck, which always needs rolls and always receives too many dessert bars. When the yard sale day arrived, the weather cooperated with a practical sky. The town set up folding tables on the church lawn, and children ran around wearing jackets they did not want to admit they needed. I laid out the teacups and the string lights, and watched a young couple buy the cake stand with the pleased surprise of people who have just imagined a tradition. "Do you bake?" I asked. "We're learning," they said. I told them to start with Mary's brownies because failure is unlikely and applause is common. They wrote it down. By noon, the box was half empty. I did not feel lighter in a cinematic way. I felt organized, which is a kind of relief that lasts longer. Lily joined me and priced a few items with clear handwriting. We took a break on the church steps. The town hummed around us with the sound of people trading what they no longer need for what someone else has been waiting to use. Not everything needs meaning. Sometimes a lamp is just a lamp moving to the right room. In the afternoon, as we packed up, Lily said she had an idea. "What if we set a monthly tea?" she asked. "Just us. No agendas. We bring a question and a memory." I looked at her grown face and saw the child who once lined up crayons by shade and insisted the dark blues did different work than the light. "Yes," I said. "First Sunday. Bring the pie if the bakery has any left." She smiled like a person setting a small flag on a hill that does not need defending. That evening, after the dishes and the walk and the radio news, I sat with my notes and wrote a short paragraph to my future self. The house is steady. Lily is learning in the same room where you are learning. You can love each other and still hold your shape. Keep the car, change the filter, read a page before bed. I closed the folder and felt the day finish itself without assistance. A week later, a woman named Ms. Carter left a card in my mailbox. She had admired the maple out front and wondered if I ever planned to sell, whether she might talk to me first. The card was polite. The handwriting was the kind that earns trust by being ordinary. I placed the card in the house folder under a tab labeled "Someday," which felt like a comfortable place for it to rest. I did not need the decision today. I needed the option to decide when it was mine to make. November arrived with gray skies and good sweaters. Lily and I tackled the garage with a timer and a rule that any argument would end in tea. We filled the donation pile slowly, which is the only speed that keeps you from giving away something you will regret. Blake carried boxes without commentary. He stacked them carefully, learned where to stand, and asked questions that had nothing to do with equity. At noon, we ate sandwiches on the porch and watched a stray leaf insist on its own choreography. During a quiet moment, Lily looked at the blue tin on the table and said she wanted to keep a copy of the Boundary email as a reminder to future me. I printed one, and she folded it with care. "It's not just about the house," she said. "It's about how we talk to you and to each other later, when we're older." I thought about the rule that had held my week in place and how it might hold hers someday too. I thought about Mary's letter and how it continued to work even after the door had closed on the room where she wrote it. As winter settled, I decorated modestly, a wreath on the door, 2 strings of new lights that do not burn out in series, a pie plate on the counter for whoever needs pie. I made room for the quiet the season invites and for the conversations it seems to rescue. Lily and I kept our first Sunday tea. We brought a question and a memory. She asked how I knew when a boundary was kind instead of stiff. I told her kind boundaries are specific, written, and held with a steady voice. Stiff ones announce themselves with volume and leave splinters. She nodded and wrote that down like a student who wants to teach. One evening after supper, I opened a box I had not touched since the funeral. Inside was a small envelope Mary had labeled in her handwriting that still knows how to reach my throat. For Anne, it said, for when steady needs company. I sat at the table and opened it slowly. Inside were 3 note cards. On one, she had written, "Rules that remember dignity." On another, "Natural consequences applied gently." On the third, "Steady is a kind of love." I placed the cards where I could see them and felt the room align around their truth. I did not sell the house in December. I did not list it in January. I walked my street and waved to neighbors. I replaced a porch bulb. I baked brownies for the potluck and came home with an empty plate and a dozen containers of dessert bars that had lost their way. I kept the second car because I like how it starts on cold mornings. I kept the blue tin on the table because I like how it sounds when it closes. Sometimes Lily missteps. Sometimes I do. We correct without ceremony. Once she forwarded a contractor quote to keep things moving. I replied with the boundary email attached in a single sentence. Let's let the rule do the talking. She sent back a heart and a new page in our shared vocabulary. Another time, I debated selling the lathe because I had not used it in years. Mr. Bennett said he would teach me again in spring. We set a date and wrote it on the calendar like a small promise. The story did not end with a sale or a move. It ended with a family keeping its shape while learning the new lines on the map. It ended with a daughter who asks instead of decides, and a mother who answers without a raised voice. It ended with paper that spoke calmly when we could not, and rules that remembered our dignity when a room tried to forget. On the first clear evening in March, I stood under the porch light and watched it warm the steps. The house breathed. The maple waited for leaves. Somewhere down the block, a child laughed, and the sound carried farther than winter expected. I locked the door and turned toward the kitchen, where a kettle would soon tell me it was ready. I set 2 cups on the counter because habit knows our best instincts. I wrote one last line in my notes and closed the cover with a quiet, satisfied click. The boundary held, I wrote. We stayed kind. We are okay.